Story 1. There was a time when the United States government rounded up 400 men with syphilis, promised them free medical care, and then knowingly gave them placebos instead of medicine. Nearly half of them died. Story 2. Henry Kissinger and the Central Intelligence Agency interfered in Central and South America. They overturned legitimate elections and installed dictators and military juntas that killed thousands. Story 3. Importing and selling drugs to the American public to fund an illegal war while simultaneously fighting against drug trafficking and incarcerating individuals for drug-related offenses. Story 4. It is difficult to determine a ranking, but I believe slavery and the genocide of indigenous peoples are the two most significant atrocities. Both of these continue to yield harmful consequences, even today. Story 5. Trail of Tears, Slavery, Jim Crow, Japanese internment camps, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Vietnam War, the bombing of Black Wall Street and Kent State. The war on drugs, mass incarceration, bank bailouts without criminal charges, trickle-down economics, and over 30 years of conflict in the Middle East. Take your pick. Story 6. It is the Native Americans who have faced atrocities that far exceed those of any other group. The government has historically mistreated Native Americans, continues to do so, and remains accountable for these actions. Although some argue that these events occurred before the establishment of the United States, it is important to recognize that once we became our own nation, we intensified the suffering. No one inflicts human suffering quite like the United States, as we often do so for profit. Story 7. The worst thing the government has done is something we not only do not know about, but will never see the light of day. The general populace of people in power in this country are not good people. Story 8. Tuskegee Syphilis Study, Trail of Tears, My Lai Massacre, No Gun Massacre, Napalm Bombings, Kent State Massacre, Abu Ghraib Prison, Guantanamo Bay. Story 9. Introduction of substance abuse in marginalized neighborhoods. Violence against indigenous people. Poisoning citizens with various chemicals and radiation to study effects. The Central Intelligence Agency is not our friend. Story 10. That's hard to pick. Wounded Knee was pretty horrifying, but if you want more information, try the book Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins. Story 11. Claiming other countries hate us because we have freedom while funding genocide and ethnic cleansing. Story 12. This list is extensive, but turning their backs on the freedmen during Reconstruction is among the most significant. The Hayes-Tilden Compromise set Black people back approximately 100 years and effectively reinstated the Confederacy in all but name. Story 13. The Paris Peace Accords could have ended in 1968 had Nixon not intervened. The Nixon campaign told the North Vietnamese army to back away from the peace table because they would receive a better deal if he was elected. The war continued, with deaths mounting through 1975. It could have been over in 1968 had Nixon not been willing to allow Americans to die just so he could obtain the presidency. Nixon is responsible for over 21,000 U.S. military deaths in Vietnam. Those lives could have been saved. This deserves to be on the list. What a terrible president. Story 14. Probably the systematic genocide of Native Americans. The numbers I have seen indicate a reduction of 96% to 99% of the Native American population, depending on the sources. If that is not genocide, I am not sure what is. Story 15. Here is a highlight reel of some negative aspects. Please be advised that reading this may lead to feelings of depression. Story 16. Overthrowing foreign governments because they were labeled as communist, which they often were not, and replacing them with puppet dictators who ultimately committed crimes against humanity is alarming. This has occurred numerous times, creating a multitude of issues that are too extensive to discuss. Story 17. There are many options to consider. The Trail of Tears is significant, but the Vietnam War stands out as a strong candidate in my lifetime. The overall death toll, including both Vietnamese and Americans, was 940,000. Story 18. We continue to improve, so it is difficult to determine. Additionally, there are many things we are not yet aware of. Story 19. Today, there was an ambush press conference with Zelensky. This week, how much time do you have? I need to start a podcast for that. Story 20. One could argue that the atomic bomb was dropped on 2 cities in Japan, resulting in the deaths of 210,000 people in 2 consecutive moments. I understand there is a lot of nuance to this incident, but I cannot think of any other man-made event that killed more people in one day. Story 21. It is difficult to identify the worst aspect without minimizing numerous atrocities. My key takeaway is that American history can be reduced to issues of racism and greed, particularly among the elite. It is hard to ignore the treatment of Native Americans, enslaved Africans, immigrants, and the poorest Americans. Story 22. American chattel slavery and the hundreds of years of brutality and government-sanctioned discrimination. Story 23. Abrogated their responsibility as the leader of the free world and the arsenal of democracy, leaving the democratic world at the mercy of aggressive, expansionist, nuclear-armed dictators and tyrants. This occurred approximately 1 hour ago. Story 24. It is still early days. Donald Trump has only been in office for 5 weeks, and his incompetence has resulted in the deaths of 70 people in the worst airplane crash in over a decade. He publicly proposed a war crime and real estate deal in Gaza, is openly blackmailing the leader of a democracy under attack from a brutal dictator, and with his first vote in the United Nations, he sided with Russia and North Korea. So stick around. It is bound to get worse. Story 25. Domestically, in no particular order, genocide of countless indigenous nations, slavery, internment camps, Guantanamo Bay. Abroad, one almost has to go by region to consider the actions of the Central Intelligence Agency. Some of the actions carried out by our military in broad daylight have also been horrendous. Perhaps it's easiest to say all the war crimes. Dropping the atomic bombs deserves a place of honor, at least near the top of the international list. Story 26. With this administration, it hasn't happened yet, and that is frankly one of the scariest thoughts I have ever had. For context, I am in my mid-50s and one of the world's biggest worrywarts, having experienced frightening thoughts my entire life. Story 27. A multitude of horrible events nearly wiped out entire groups of people, including slavery and Japanese internment camps. The worst part in the present day is the desire among some Americans to hide this history by banning books and critical race theory, as well as wanting to eliminate Martin Luther King Jr. Day. This perpetuates a cycle of shame, especially for a country that refuses to change. Story 28. Tuskegee, where Black service members were intentionally infected with syphilis, and Japanese internment camps are just 2 examples. Story 29. Explicit approval of slavery through the 3/5 compromise or the literal genocide of indigenous people. There is a reason Nazis looked to America for ideas when developing the final solution. Story 30. My God, there is a lot of serious wrongdoing, such as the treatment of Native Americans, slavery, and the Tuskegee experiment in which men were given sexually transmitted diseases. Additionally, the radioactive fallout from the first atomic bomb test affected civilians. I could go on, but my gut reaction is to focus on the treatment of Native Americans. This is why you shouldn't trust the government, not even the Democrats. Story 31. Slavery and the systemic racism and oppression of African Americans that followed, as well as the genocide of Native Americans, are undoubtedly the top 2 issues. Japanese internment camps, the overthrow and annexation of Hawaii, and Mormon persecution all follow in some order. The mass incarcerations, healthcare disparities, educational inequalities, and financial inequities are less specific but still have a place in the argument. Story 32. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy remains the most significant coup in United States history. The continued classification of related documents highlights this fact. Story 33. Jesus, where to even start? 2 nuclear bombs were dropped on Japan, vaporizing hundreds of thousands. The unhinged use of Agent Orange in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, propping up numerous horrific military dictatorships in Latin America, Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. Unwavering support and arming of Israel to conduct ethnic cleansing and genocide against Palestinians for decades. Project MKUltra. Story 34. MKUltra was a large-scale experiment focused on mind control. Various methods have been used since the Cold War to achieve control over individuals, ranging from drugs to sexual manipulation, mass hypnosis, and more. Recently, the COVID-19 scare served as an effective method for control. Fear of the unknown has proven to be a powerful tool in influencing a population. When people lack knowledge about a threat, they are more likely to adhere to theories and propose solutions out of fear. Despite numerous theories on how to prevent or combat the pandemic, millions lost their lives. Story 35. That's a tough one. I would choose either the Trail of Tears or the invasion of a country without actual evidence of weapons of mass destruction during Desert Storm. A close second would be rounding up thousands of innocent people during World War II because they were Japanese. Story 36. Government is not a thing. It is a framework. The Trail of Tears, an atrocity, was not committed by the government. It was committed by people. Do not let them off the hook. Story 37. It grows clearer every day. Citizens united. Allowing unlimited money into politics has created a situation that is beginning to play out. Is anyone surprised that the world's richest man undermines the president in his own office? Story 38. God. There are so many things to choose from. Supporting military coups to overthrow democratically elected governments is one. Japanese internment, the annihilation of Native Americans, and refusing Jewish refugees during the Holocaust are others. Funding genocide by sending money and weapons, as well as invading foreign countries under completely fabricated pretenses, also stand out. I could go on. Story 39. It is currently happening. The current administration's plans are being enacted, and the future they envision will kill, torture, starve, and bankrupt people on a scale we have not seen before. The former president is building concentration camps. A public figure talks about forced reparenting camps for mental illness, marginalized groups, and eventually you consider reading First They Came for a preview of our new world. Older individuals are going to be removed from nursing homes due to cuts in Medicaid, as funding for long-term care does not come from Medicare. They will starve as Social Security faces reduced support and is rated for personal use. The children of older individuals will go bankrupt paying for care. Do you have $15,000 a month for a nursing home? States are pursuing the assets of these children. Millions of children will go hungry due to the removal of the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program and die from diseases, as immunization campaigns are cut and misinformation about vaccine spreads. Lack of medical care will also result from cuts to Medicaid funding. Child abuse will increase. Border patrols are no longer required to wear body cameras. What kind of child abuse do you think is occurring without oversight? There will be more incidents of sexual violence with less legal and political support for victims. Pregnancy-related deaths will rise, as seen in Texas, alongside general abuse, such as the promotion of covenant marriages and the removal of access to birth control in several states. Millions will lose their homes and businesses. What happens when 10% of a 2.4 million person workforce is laid off quickly? Businesses that rely on these workers will suffer, leading to further layoffs and worsening conditions. Suicide rates will increase. Health will decline. Education will suffer. Millions will die, and the former president and his associates do not care. The troubling part is that millions of people will support them as they dismantle our nation. If you think you will be paying less in taxes, I have news for you: you won't see any savings. You will only pay more and more. Those government savings will go directly into their pockets. You wanted the government to be run like a business. Well, be prepared to pay the maximum they can charge for everything. That's the goal of businesses. This is only in the United States. The collapse of foreign aid is already leading to suffering overseas. Technology, centralization, and the belief that legal equals ethical and efficient business equals good governance are significant issues. How much easier will it be to harm groups of people with artificial intelligence? How much easier will it be to limit people's travel, economic opportunities, family planning, and education with large-scale data? Story 40. Why is Trump contacting Guinness World Records to try to top it? I am sure that whatever the answer is, it will not compare to what his supporters have planned. Story 41. Meddling in the affairs of foreign sovereign nations, hands down. It emboldened them to bring those tactics here to illegally assault their own countrymen. Story 42. How much time do you have? This may not qualify as the worst, but the United States government was involved in some brutal covert and overt interventions in Latin America during the second half of the 20th century. For example, read about Operations PB Success and PB Fortune, which are believed to have contributed to deaths and disappearances estimated in the hundreds of thousands in Guatemala. Story 43. I wouldn't attribute it to just one thing. Most of the comments contain worthwhile insights regarding the mistakes made by our government. What troubles me is that some individuals actively read these discussions and still advocate for increased government power over our lives. Story 44. There are many obvious faults, but the aspect with the biggest impact for us today could be how the South was let off the hook after the Civil War. Many leaders in the South remained in power when they should have been tried for treason. The myth of the lost cause made the whole issue and treatment of former slaves and their descendants unclear, and we never fully confronted the reality of those atrocities. Story 45. Reddit does not provide enough characters to write a proper response. The United States has harmed the earth for humanity. Their greed has destroyed our existence. I am certain that is what extraterrestrial beings will inscribe on our tombstone on the moon. Story 46. Nuclear testing at Bikini Atoll displaced the islanders and exposed sailors to radioactive contamination during subsequent cleanup and investigation efforts. Attempts to resettle the islanders were made, but they were evacuated again when radioactive cesium accumulated in their bodies. Story 47. We will likely never know, as it was never discussed. It was paid for using undisclosed funds by an unknown agency, and its files do not exist. Story 48. The United States government is a large organization with a long history spanning over 250 years. What we did to the indigenous people was horrific. The enslavement of Africans was also horrific, though I do not know what role the U.S. government played other than allowing it. There is no telling what atrocities occurred within the intelligence or defense sectors. The Tuskegee syphilis study was particularly troubling. This was conducted by the U.S. Public Health Service. One might expect these kinds of things to happen in defense or intelligence studies, but it is shocking that a public health study allowed syphilis to spread within Black communities to observe its transmission and persistence, despite the discovery of antibiotics. We dropped nuclear bombs on Japan twice. This might be justified as a quicker end to the war, but it still resulted in the vaporization of many people, making it a significant atrocity. Story 49. Come on, it's slavery all day long. They held around 12 million people captive, selling away 4-year-old boys from their families, never to be seen again. They sold fancy slaves, who were mostly the lightest-skinned individuals born to enslaved mothers for the sex trade. The list goes on, and much of it was never even included in high school textbooks. Story 50. You would be hard-pressed to outdo 240 years of slavery and the Jim Crow laws that institutionalized racism. Jim Crow laws mandated segregation in schools, parks, libraries, and more. Whites only and colored signs were used to enforce racial segregation. Black people were often denied the right to vote through literacy tests and other racially motivated criteria. Property owners signed restrictive covenants that barred African Americans from many neighborhoods. Jim Crow laws were in effect from the 1890s until the mid-1960s. The last of the Jim Crow laws were generally overturned in 1965. The Supreme Court established the doctrine of separate but equal in Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896. The Supreme Court ruled in civil rights cases of 1883 that the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was unconstitutional. What is the worst thing that the United States government has ever done? Story 51. Slavery was a legal institution in the United States from 1776 until 1865. It was primarily practiced in the southern United States. Story 52. Slavery, the Trail of Tears, the war in Iraq, and the Vietnam War are significant historical events. The impact of late-stage capitalism is also worth discussing. Should I continue? Story 53. It is challenging to choose between the genocide of Native Americans and slavery. Both were undeniably horrific. I find myself leaning towards the genocide of Native Americans, as it feels like an entire culture was completely erased. African and African American cultures still exist and are very present today, while Native American culture seems at times to have been entirely obliterated. Story 54. I find it interesting that the majority of answers highlight actions the United States has taken against non-Americans, such as the Trail of Tears. The purpose of a government is to prioritize the interests of its citizens. With this principle in mind, it is clear that allowing free trade has undermined America's industrial capacity, and that excessive spending has resulted in a substantial national debt. Story 55. In recent memory, funding and training of the Mexican drug cartels have been notable issues. Additionally, the Trail of Tears and Japanese internment camps remain significant historical events. Story 56. Supporting every dictatorship in the rest of the American continent and encouraging and funding most of them. Pinochet, Somoza, and Videla are high on the list. Story 57. Slavery is our original sin, and its consequences still haunt us today. That's why it's important to learn about the country's racist past to better understand its racist present. Honorable mentions include the Trail of Tears, the dropping of the atomic bomb, the internment of Japanese Americans, the overthrow of democratically elected governments to install US-friendly dictators, and the onset of the Spanish-American War. Story 58. If I were to remove Facebook posts, it would feel like merely existing. However, I agree with the historical significance of the Trail of Tears and Japanese internment camps. Story 59. The fact that you could rewrite "We didn't start the fire" with all of the atrocities that the United States has either participated in or idly allowed to happen is very revealing. Story 60. I don't think it is possible to narrow the various atrocities down to just one that was the worst. The second atomic bomb on Nagasaki was unnecessary, with death estimates of 250,000 people. Surrender was possible, but there was a push to use the design of the second bomb, codifying a class of humans as property and later as only 3/5 that of a Caucasian. The slaughter of millions of indigenous people and the subsequent theft of their land, breaking treaties that had been signed by both sides in supposed good faith. Story 61. There are many good answers to this question. One answer that fits well is Project 100,000, as the government targeted a vulnerable segment of the U.S. population. The U.S. military recruited individuals who typically did not meet military requirements, including those with physical disabilities, those underweight or overweight, and individuals with low IQ. They framed this initiative as gainful employment, but it resulted in these recruits being 3 times more likely to die compared to the average soldier. Story 62. The genocide of indigenous peoples and the allowance of slavery and perpetual indentured servitude. Story 63. To its own citizens, probably when they kidnapped random people off the street to experiment with drugs without their consent. Story 64. The Central Intelligence Agency is involved in controversial activities around the world for the benefit of its nation. I have no evidence to support this. I look to individuals like Noam Chomsky for guidance in this area. When he passes away, the world will be worse off. Story 65. To have this conversation, a distinction needs to be made between pre- and post-Civil War America. Both periods experienced significant atrocities. However, prior to the Civil War, such actions were more normalized, which in a way makes the actions after the Civil War worse, as we should have known better. Story 66. What we did to the African American population. The way we massacred the natives. The way we crushed the Japanese within our own borders, dropped atomic bombs on civilians, built profit-driven prison systems, invested heavily in arms manufacturing and compromised education, the turmoil in the Middle East, electing Donald Trump, administered syphilis to African Americans as part of an experiment, granted immunity to Nazis for technological advancements, accumulated massive amounts of debt and then sold that debt to China, effectively requiring American taxpayers to pay interest to China while our schools and hospitals deteriorate. I could go on. Story 67. The Tuskegee syphilis study experiments on black men are highly unethical, horrifying, and disturbing. Story 68. Allow a foreign individual to enter and begin cutting social programs and any initiatives that had lawsuits against their questionable businesses, enabling them to secure all government contracts for themselves. Story 69. They are currently damaging their own country for the benefit of wealthy individuals. The United States is in a decline, and the people do not even recognize it. Story 70. Injustice to Native Americans. Injustice to Japanese American citizens during World War II. Injustice to Vietnam veterans by deceiving the American public about the reasons for the war. Deception regarding weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. There is much more. It is not just one issue. Story 71. Setting up the narrative so that people around the world doubt or justify the atrocities they have committed. Story 72. Experiments on children are conducted to determine human breaking points. This includes starving a group and then providing them just enough food to survive, or forcing another group to eat only one type of food to observe its effects on them. Story 73. Trail of Tears. While we have done many terrible things, this one stands out to me. Story 74. Far from the worst, of course, but hugely understated. It severely eroded trust in modern medicine throughout the developing world. Story 75. There is a tie between the Trail of Tears and the internment of Japanese Americans and German Americans who were born in the United States during World War II. Story 76. We have committed mass murder on a large scale several times, stolen land, and claimed it has valuable resources, forcing others to relocate. We have installed dictators for our own interests and secretly arms corrupt regimes worldwide. Our actions have significantly contributed to the world's economic crisis through deregulation. We are responsible for a substantial amount of pollution and environmental damage, harming future generations. If I had to choose one issue, your daughter kicked my dog. Story 77. Enslaving Black people and allowing their lynchings, castrations, and the sale of their family members without compensation. Story 78. Slavery, Native American oppression, and the theft of lands are significant issues. Illegal foreign government coups also contribute to a long list of injustices. Story 79. I'm guessing we don't even know. A political science professor in college who had a background in military intelligence once told us in class that your country does things you think only other countries do. I'll never forget that. Story 80. The Philippine-American War is not the deadliest in terms of casualties, but it was brutal in terms of atrocities and is not often discussed. Story 81. You all got the big ones. I will add the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. It lasted for 40 years and involved purposely giving rural Southern Black men syphilis without any treatment. Story 82. There are too many to count or rank. It would be easier to identify the worst thing they did in a particular decade. Story 83. I am deeply troubled by the state of this country, a land where exploitation prevails and the value of the dollar is prioritized over human life, care, concern, and empathy. There seems to be no justice or accountability for those responsible for atrocities, including the harm caused to my grandmother through chemical warfare experiments in the 1950s. The absence of accountability is infuriating, and it feels as though there is a relentless cycle of lies and denial. Many people are influenced to believe that voting and political party affiliation truly make a difference. It's a frustrating situation. Story 84. I fought a devastating civil war over the right to own and abuse humans. It is unfathomable. Story 85. The story of the Bikini Islands is quite disturbing. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.